Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Easy English Spark channel. I'm so excited to have you here today. If you love thrilling adventures, mysterious legends, and stories that keep you on the edge of your seat, you're in the right place. Today, we're diving into an incredible journey, one that will challenge your English listening and speaking skills, expand your vocabulary, and help you speak more fluently through immersive storytelling. Get ready to explore the unknown, uncover secrets hidden in the mountains, and face the legendary Toro as we embark on this gripping adventure together. Let's get started and light up your English journey. Chapter 1. A Man Without a Purpose. Ethan Brooks was a chef. He had spent 5 years studying the art of cooking at a prestigious culinary school. But despite all those years of training, despite all the skills he had perfected, he was still searching for something. When he left college, Ethan expected to find a career that would excite him. He imagined himself working in a high-class restaurant, creating exquisite dishes, and feeling proud of his work. But reality was far different from his dreams. His first job was in a hotel kitchen, a place where chefs moved like machines, preparing meals without passion, following recipes without creativity. Ethan hated it. He quit after only a few months. Then, he worked in a busy restaurant in the heart of the city. It was stressful. The heat of the kitchen, the constant shouting of orders, the never-ending rush. It drained him. 6 months later, he left. After that, Ethan took several short-term jobs. He worked in a school cafeteria, then in a hospital kitchen. But he never stayed for long. Sometimes he left because he disliked the boss. Other times because the work felt meaningless. And so, months passed. The calendar changed, but Ethan's situation remained the same. Now, it was the month of May, and he had been unemployed for 4 months. 4 long months of searching and finding nothing. The mountains were calling. When the weekend arrived, Ethan did not look for work. Instead, he escaped. Every Saturday morning, while others hurried to their jobs, Ethan packed his gear and headed for the mountains. He had loved the mountains since he was a child. They were not far from the city, just a few hours by train, but they felt like another world. Up there, among the icy peaks and deep valleys, life was different. There were no bosses to give orders, no noisy kitchens, no deadlines, just the eye. Sound of the wind, the smell of the pine trees, and the thrill of the climb. Here, Ethan felt free. Here, every day was unpredictable, and every climb was an adventure. But no matter how high he climbed, he always had to come back down. Every Sunday evening, Ethan returned to the city. He unlocked the door of his small apartment, took off his boots, and reminded himself of the truth. The mountains were not a job. The mountains would not pay his rent. The mountains were just an escape, and he needed something more. A life without direction, Ethan lived in a small, worn-down apartment in the suburbs. He shared it with Daniel Shaw, an old college friend. Their place wasn't much, just a couple of small rooms, cheap furniture, and a kitchen that Ethan rarely used. The walls of Ethan's room were covered with pictures of mountains and mountaineers. There were climbing ropes and gear scattered on the floor. His bed was always unmade. His books piled up in messy stacks. One morning, as Ethan sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, Daniel walked in. Daniel glanced at Ethan's messy hair, the dark circles under his eyes, and the job listings in front of him. "Any luck?" he asked. Ethan sighed. "No, nothing." "Exciting?" Daniel laughed. "You always say that. Maybe you're looking for the wrong kind of job." Ethan leaned back. "What other kind of job is there?" Daniel smirked. "Something adventurous. Something that makes your heart race. Something that makes you feel like you're climbing a mountain." Ethan chuckled. "I don't think jobs like that exist." But he was wrong. The ad that changed everything. That Monday morning, the city was gray. The rain poured down as Ethan walked through the streets. He needed a job, any job. He stopped at a small newspaper stand on the corner, bought a copy, and walked back home. Sitting by the window, he flipped through the pages, scanning the job listings. Nothing. Nothing. Just the same boring jobs he had seen before. He sighed and was about to toss the paper aside when something caught his eye. A small advertisement on the back page. It was different from the rest. It didn't mention hotels or restaurants. It didn't talk about wages or work hours. Instead, it read, "Cook wanted. Are you an experienced chef? Are you between 25 and 30 years old? Are you strong, healthy, and a skilled climber? We are searching for a cook to join a scientific expedition to the mountains of northern Afghanistan. This is not an ordinary job. It is an opportunity to be part of history. We are going to search for the Toro, a legendary creature believed to roam the mountains. No expedition has ever seen it. We will be the first. Apply immediately. Professor Howard Marks, Museum of Natural Science, London." Ethan froze. He read it again and again. His heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't just a job. This was the adventure he had been waiting for. He grabbed the paper and ran to Daniel's room. "Daniel!" he shouted. "Look at this!" Daniel rubbed his eyes and took the newspaper. After a few seconds, he looked up, stunned. "You're kidding me. This job was made for you." Ethan grinned. "I know." For the first time in years, Ethan Brooks felt alive, and he had already made his decision. He was going to apply. Chapter 2. A Job Like No Other. Ethan Brooks had made up his mind. He was going to apply for the job. It wasn't just a decision, it felt like destiny. This wasn't another dull kitchen job in a crowded city. This was an expedition, a journey to the unknown, a chance to be part of something far bigger than himself. For the first time in months, Ethan felt excited, but excitement alone wouldn't get him the job. He needed to act fast. The application. Ethan wasted no time. He grabbed a pen and a blank sheet of paper, but for a moment he hesitated. He hadn't written a formal letter in years. Taking a deep breath, he began. "Dear Professor Marks, I am writing to apply for the position of cook on your expedition to northern Afghanistan. I have spent the last 5 years studying culinary arts and have experience working in multiple kitchens. But beyond that, I am also an experienced mountaineer. For as long as I can remember, the mountains have been my second home. I have climbed in extreme conditions, camped in the wilderness, and survived in some of the toughest environments. I believe my skills as a chef and my abilities as a climber make me a perfect candidate for this role. I look forward to the opportunity to discuss this further. Sincerely, Ethan Brooks." He read the letter once, then twice. It was short, but it was clear. He folded the paper, placed it in an envelope, and wrote the address from the newspaper ad, Professor Howard Marks, Museum of Natural Science, London. The moment he dropped the envelope into the mailbox, his heart raced. Now there was nothing to do but wait. The call that changed everything. 3 days passed. Ethan checked his mailbox every morning. Nothing. By the 4th day, he was beginning to think he had wasted his time. But then, the phone rang. He grabbed it instantly. "Hello?" A woman's voice answered. "Mr. Brooks?" "Yes." "This is Helen Ward, Secretary to Professor Howard Marks. We have received your application." Ethan's pulse quickened. "Yes. And?" There was a brief pause before she spoke again. The professor would like to meet you for an interview. Can you come to London this Friday at 11 a.m.? Ethan grinned. Absolutely. Good. You will meet him at the Museum of Natural Science. Don't be late. The call ended. Ethan stared at the phone, barely able to believe it. He had an interview. He had a chance. Now he just had to convince the professor that he was the right man for the job. The journey to London. Friday morning, 5 a.m. Ethan packed a small bag and caught the first train to London. The journey was long, and as the city skyline came into view, doubt crept into his mind. Would Professor Marks think he was good enough? Would the expedition be as exciting as it seemed, or was this all just a waste of time? Pushing those thoughts aside, he arrived at the museum an hour early. It was a massive stone building, old and intimidating. Inside, the air smelled like dusty books and ancient artifacts. A large sign read, Museum of Natural Science, where the past meets the future. Ethan took a deep breath and stepped inside, meeting the professor. At exactly 10:55 a.m., a well-dressed woman approached him in the museum's grand hall. Mr. Brooks? Yes. Follow me. Professor Marks will see you now. She led him through long corridors filled with skeletons of prehistoric creatures, ancient maps, and dusty cabinets filled with scientific specimens. Finally, she stopped in front of a heavy wooden door. She knocked. Professor? Mr. Brooks is here. A deep voice from inside responded. Send him in. Ethan stepped inside and froze. The office was massive, filled with bookshelves, strange artifacts, and maps of the world. But one thing stood out. Right in the center of the room was a giant wooden sculpture of a creature unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. It stood nearly 9 feet tall. Its body was covered in thick, dark fur, its arms long and powerful, its hands ending in enormous, razor-sharp red claws. Its face was the most terrifying part, a combination of bird and beast with a beak that looked like it could tear through flesh. Ethan stared in disbelief. What is that? A man with silver hair and sharp eyes stood behind a desk, watching him closely. That, he said with a slight smile, is the Toro. Ethan turned to face him. Professor Marks? The professor nodded. Tell me, Mr. Brooks, do you believe in legends? The interview. Ethan took a seat. The professor sat across from him, hands folded. So you want to join my expedition? Yes, Ethan replied. I do. Why? Ethan hesitated, then answered honestly, "Because I want adventure, because I love the mountains, and because I think the world still has secrets left to discover." The professor narrowed his eyes. "Are you afraid of danger?" Ethan smirked. "No." Professor Marks studied him for a long moment. Then suddenly he stood up and walked over to the wooden sculpture. "Most people believe the Toro is a myth," he said. "A legend passed down by locals, but I know better." Ethan leaned forward. "Why?" "The Professor turned to him, eyes burning with intensity. "Because I've seen the Toro's tracks, and I've seen what it can do." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" Professor Marks took a deep breath. "On my last expedition, 4 men disappeared on Mount Kedar. We never found their bodies, but we found these." He opened a drawer and pulled out a series of photographs. Ethan took them and stared in shock. The images showed massive claw marks in the snow. But that wasn't the worst part. One of the photos showed a torn piece of clothing, covered in blood. Professor Marks sat back down. "Still want the job, Mr. Brooks?" Ethan slowly put the photos down. He had a choice. He could walk away, forget all of this, and go back to his life of meaningless jobs. Or he could say yes and face the unknown. Ethan took a deep breath. Then he looked the professor straight in the eye. "When do we leave?" Chapter 3. A dangerous journey begins. The decision had been made. Ethan Brooks was no longer just a chef searching for work. He was now a member of a scientific expedition to one of the most remote and dangerous places in the world, the mountains of northern Afghanistan. He had no idea what awaited him there, but one thing was certain. This was no ordinary job. The final preparations. After accepting the position, Ethan was given a thick folder containing everything he needed to know about the expedition. Inside were detailed maps, weather forecasts, a schedule, and a long list of rules and protocols. But one section stood out. At the very top of the last page, written in bold letters, was a warning. "The Toro is a deadly creature. Extreme caution is required at all times. Do not travel alone. Do not separate from the group. If you hear something in the night, do not investigate." Ethan frowned as he read it. Was this real? Either way, he was about to find out. Meeting the team. On July 30, first Ethan arrived back in London for the first official meeting of the expedition. The team had gathered in a private conference room inside the Museum of Natural Science. There were 15 members in total. Professor Howard Marks, the expedition leader, a man obsessed with proving the Toro's existence. Dr. Evelyn Carter, AII, zoologist and wildlife expert. Dr. Richard Hale, a historian specializing in ancient legends. Gregory Shaw, the medical officer. Daniel Reed, the quartermaster in charge of equipment. Kareem Rahman, an experienced Afghan guide and tracker. 8 porters who would carry supplies. And finally, Ethan, the expedition's cook. The room was filled with maps, documents, and large metal crates labeled with supplies, rope, medical equipment, food, radio devices, and in the corner, a single large metal box with a red label that read, "Private, do not open." It belonged to Professor Marks. Ethan exchanged glances with Daniel, who whispered, "That thing gives me a bad feeling." Ethan nodded. "Me too." Professor Marks entered the room, clapping his hands. "Gentlemen, welcome. Today, we prepare for history." The meeting began. The plan. The professor walked over to a large map pinned to the wall. He pointed to a region in northern Afghanistan, deep in the mountains. "This is our destination," he said. "Mount Kedar." The plan was simple, but dangerous. Fly from London to Kabul, travel by truck to the village of Ked, hire local porters, and begin the climb into the mountains. Reach the Mantra Pass, where recent reports claimed that the Toro's claw marks had been seen. Find evidence of the creature. But there was a problem. Dr. Carter raised her hand. "What about the weather?" Marks hesitated. "We're going at the worst possible time. The snow is already falling. If we wait too long, the pass could be blocked completely." Dr. Hale frowned. "And yet, we're still going?" Marks nodded. "We don't have a choice. If we wait until next year, someone else might get there first." There was an uneasy silence in the room. Ethan could already tell. Not everyone trusted the professor's judgment. The journey to Afghanistan. On September 1st, the expedition boarded a plane to Kabul, Afghanistan. The moment they stepped off, they were hit by a wave of dry, cold air. The mountains loomed in the distance, tall, silent, and covered in thick snow. Ethan felt a chill, not from the air, but from the feeling that something was waiting for them. After a brief rest in the city, they loaded their supplies onto 2 old trucks and began the long drive to Ked, the last village before the wilderness. Chatiya. Roads were rough, Dust and sand blew into their faces. The engines groaned under the weight of the supplies. Hours passed, and then a problem. Karim, the guide, suddenly told the driver to stop. Everyone looked at him. "What is it?" asked Ethan. Karim pointed at the road ahead. It was covered in huge claw marks stretching across the dirt path. The same claw marks from the professor's photographs. The team stared in silence. Professor Mark smiled. "We're getting close." Ethan, however, felt the first true wave of fear. The village of Ked. By nightfall, they arrived in Ked, a small and isolated village at the base of the mountains. The houses were old and made of stone, their roofs covered in snow. The people of Ked were quiet, suspicious. As the team stepped out of the trucks, dozens of eyes watched them from windows and doorways. They weren't welcoming. They were afraid. Group of old men approached Karim and spoke in hushed voices. Ethan didn't understand their language, but he could tell something was wrong. After a few moments, Karim turned to the group. His face was serious. "They say we should not go. They say the Toro is already watching us." Dr. Hale laughed. "Do they actually believe in the Toro?" Karim nodded. "Yes, and they say we will die if we go further." Professor Mark stepped forward. "Tell them we appreciate their concern, but we're going anyway." Karim hesitated, then translated the professor's words. The old men shook their heads. One of them held up his hand like a claw and made a motion across his throat. Ethan didn't need a translator to understand what that meant. The final night before the ascent. That night, the team stayed in an old house at the edge of the village. The porters gathered in one room, whispering among themselves. Some looked uneasy, others angry. Ethan sat by a small fire, staring at the metal box marked "Private." Daniel sat next to him. "What do you think is in that box?" he asked. Ethan shrugged. "Something the professor doesn't want us to see." A sudden howling wind outside made the wooden walls creak. The fire flickered. From somewhere far in the distance, a sound echoed through the night. Low, deep, almost inhuman. Everyone in the room went silent. Ethan's hands clenched. It had begun. Tomorrow, they would enter the mountains. Tomorrow, they would start the real journey, and by the time it was over, not all of them would return. Chapter 4. Climbing Towards the Unknown. The morning was cold. The wind howled through the narrow streets of Ked, carrying with it the scent of snow and burning wood. Ethan Brooks pulled his jacket tighter around his body and stepped out into the village square. The rest of the expedition team was already gathered, loading the last of their supplies onto mules that would carry their gear up into the mountains. The local porters, hired to assist in the climb, moved quickly and efficiently, but their faces were filled with unease. None of them spoke much, but Ethan could feel their fear. Kareem, their guide, stood near the entrance to the trail, speaking in hushed tones with one of the village elders. The old man looked at him with serious, sun-wrinkled eyes before turning away without another word. "What was that about?" Ethan asked as he approached. Kareem took a deep breath. "He says this will be the last time we ever see Ked." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "So they really believe the Toro will kill us?" Kareem didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked up at the mountains, their snow-covered peaks piercing the sky like jagged teeth. "It's not just the Toro," he finally said. "The mountains themselves have taken many lives. If we are not careful, they will take ours too." A shiver ran down Ethan's spine, but before he could reply, Professor Mark stepped forward. "Let's move out," he commanded. "We have a long way to go." And just like that, the expedition began. The ascent begins. The team left Ked behind. Climbing into the wilderness, the path was narrow and winding, leading them higher and higher into the mountains. Thick pine forests surrounded them, the air growing thinner with every step. At first, the climb was manageable. The trail was well worn, used by travelers and traders for centuries. But as they went deeper, the path became steeper, rockier, and more dangerous. Ethan, though experienced in mountain climbing, could feel the weight of the journey pressing down on him. The altitude made every step harder. Behind him, Daniel let out a frustrated sigh. "You sure this is the easy part?" he grumbled. Ethan smirked. "Welcome to the mountains." Professor Marks led the group, his pace relentless. It was clear he had no interest in slowing down. The Toro was all that mattered to him, but not everyone shared his enthusiasm. The scientists struggled with the climb. The porters whispered among themselves, constantly glancing at the shadows between the trees, as if expecting something to jump out. And as the day wore on, a deep sense of unease settled over the group. Something didn't feel right. The first signs of danger. By late afternoon, they reached a small clearing where they decided to set up camp for the night. The porters, relieved to stop, immediately started a fire and began preparing a meal. Ethan, as the cook, unpacked his supplies. The scent of boiling soup and warm bread filled the cold evening air, offering a brief sense of comfort. But then, a sharp, panicked cry echoed through the trees. Everyone froze. Ethan spun around, his heart pounding. One of the porters had dropped, his supplies, his face pale with terror. He was pointing at the ground, claw marks, huge, deep, fresh. Professor Marks rushed forward, eyes wide with excitement. Incredible, he whispered, kneeling beside the marks. The Toro has been here. But while the professor was thrilled, the porters were horrified. One of them grabbed Kareem's arm, speaking quickly in Pashto, his voice full of fear. Kareem turned to the group. He says we need to leave. Now. Professor Marks laughed. Leave? We just got here. Kareem's face was grim. He says the Toro is hunting. Silence. The wind howled through the trees. The fire flickered. Then, from somewhere in the distance, a sound rose through the night air. Low, deep, inhuman. A long rumbling growl that made the very ground seem to tremble. The hairs on Ethan's arms stood on end. Whatever had made that sound, it wasn't far away. Nightfall in the mountains. Despite the warnings, Professor Marks refused to leave. If the Toro is close, then this is exactly where we need to be. And so, the team stayed. But no one truly slept that night. Ethan lay in his tent, staring at the fabric fluttering in the wind. His body was exhausted, but his mind was alert, restless. Every so often he would hear something, a branch snapping, footsteps crunching in the snow. Or was it just his imagination? Somewhere nearby, Daniel whispered, "Are you awake?" "Yeah." Pause. "You think it's real?" Ethan didn't answer, because deep down he already knew the truth. The vanishing. Morning came. The sky was gray, heavy with clouds. The wind had died down, leaving the world eerily silent. Ethan crawled out of his tent, stretching his sore muscles. Around him, the team was already packing up, preparing for another day of climbing. But then, someone shouted in alarm. Everyone turned. One of the porters was missing. Guy Walker, a young scientist who had taken night watch, was nowhere to be found. His tent was empty. His boots were still there. His jacket was gone. But the strangest part? There were no footprints leading away from the camp. It was as if he had simply vanished. Professor Marks refused to panic. "He probably wandered off. We'll find him." But the porters disagreed. They were already gathering their things, shaking their heads, preparing to leave. One of them pointed to the trees and whispered something in a trembling voice. Karim translated. The Toro took him. A deadly choice. 4. The first time, Ethan saw doubt in the professor's eyes, but only for a second. Then, Mark straightened his shoulders and turned to the group. Listen to me. The expedition will continue. The Toro is near. I can feel it. If Guy is missing, we will search for him, but we will not turn back. No one spoke. Then, one by one, the porters dropped their supplies and walked away. Ethan watched as nearly half the team disappeared back down the mountain. A deep sense of dread filled his stomach. They should have gone with them. But it was too late now. They had chosen to continue forward. And soon, they would realize they had made a terrible mistake. Chapter 5. A Deadly Secret. The sun struggled to break through the thick clouds above, casting a dull gray light over the camp. The wind had died down, leaving behind an unnatural silence. It was as if the entire mountain was holding its breath. Ethan, Brooks stood near the remains of the fire, staring at Guy Walker's empty tent. His backpack was still there, his supplies untouched, but he was gone. No footprints, no sign of a struggle, just vanished. The porters had already left, their fear overwhelming any sense of duty. But for the rest of the team, turning back was not an option, especially for Professor Marks. He stood at the center of the camp, staring up at the towering peaks above. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with obsession. We move forward, he said firmly. Dr. Carter, the zoologist, frowned. But what about Guy? We need to search for him. Mark shook his head. He's gone. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. That's it? That's all you have to say? The professor turned to him. What do you want me to say, Mr. Brooks? Do you want me to tell you we should waste an entire day looking for a man who likely walked off into the storm and froze to death? Ethan clenched his fists. You don't know that. Mark smiled coldly. No, I don't. But what I do know is that the Toro is close. And we're not going to lose our chance because of one man's mistake. The group exchanged uneasy glances. No one spoke. No one dared to argue with him. And so, with the loss of a team member weighing heavily on them, the expedition continued upward, a mountain of shadows. The climb grew more treacherous. The once rocky path had turned into a narrow trail covered in snow and ice, forcing them to move slowly and carefully. With each step, the altitude pressed down on them. Their breaths came in short gasps. Their muscles burned, and exhaustion began to take hold. But Ethan's mind was elsewhere. What happened to Guy? Did he truly wander off and get lost? Or was he taken? He glanced at Kareem, their guide, who had been unusually quiet since the morning. Ethan fell in step beside him. "You don't believe the professor, do you?" Kareem didn't answer at first. Then, in a low voice, he said, "I have seen this before." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Kareem's dark eyes met his. "The last expedition, 4 men disappeared just like this, one by one." Ethan felt a chill crawl down his spine. "And you think the Toro took them?" Kareem shook his head. "I don't know. But I know this. When the first man disappeared, the professor said the same thing. He wandered off. It was a mistake. We moved forward. And then more men went missing." Ethan swallowed hard. "And no one questioned him?" Kareem's voice was flat. "No one was left to." A deep uneasiness settled in Ethan's chest. Was history repeating itself? He didn't know. But what he did know was this: Professor Marks was hiding something. A clue in the snow. Hours passed. The wind howled through the peaks, the sky darkening as the storm clouds thickened. Then something changed. Kareem suddenly stopped. He raised a hand, signaling the others to halt. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. "What is it?" Kareem knelt down in the snow, brushing it aside with his gloved hands. And there, beneath the freshly fallen snow, was a set of tracks. They were massive, deep, unmistakable. Claw marks. Marks hurried forward, his eyes lit up with excitement. "Yes, this is it!" But Ethan wasn't looking at the claw marks. He was looking at something else. A few feet away, half buried in the snow, was a torn piece of fabric. A piece of fabric that looked exactly like the jacket Guy had been wearing the night before. Ethan's blood ran cold. He turned to the others. "Does this look like something that a man just wandered into?" Nobody answered, because deep down, they all knew the truth. Guy hadn't left on his own. Something had taken him. The forbidden box. That night, they set up camp in a rocky alcove, using the towering stone walls as protection from the wind. The mood was grim. The scientists whispered among themselves. The porters, now only a handful remaining, kept glancing at the trees, muttering prayers under their breath. Even Professor Marks was unusually quiet. Ethan sat by the fire, trying to make sense of it all. Why was the professor acting like this? Why did he refuse to search for Guy? Why did this feel planned? Then his eyes landed on something. The large metal box, the one marked private. Ethan's pulse quickened. He looked around. Most of the team was busy with their own thoughts. This was his chance. Moving carefully, he approached the box and crouched down beside it. The lock was sturdy, but not impossible. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small knife. He hesitated. If he got caught, Marks would lose his mind, but he had to know. With steady hands, he slid the tip of the knife into the lock and gently twisted. Click. The lock popped open. Ethan slowly lifted the lid, and what he saw stole the breath from his lungs. Inside, the box, carefully packed in straw, was a massive wooden claw. It was identical to the ones they had seen in the snow. Identical. His mind raced. Marks had been faking the tracks. Marks had been lying to them. And worst of all, Marks had been here. Before, a shadow fell over him. Enjoying yourself, Mr. Brooks. Ethan's blood turned to ice. Slowly, he turned around. Professor Marks stood above him, his face emotionless. But his eyes burned with something else, something dangerous, a threat in the dark. For a long moment, no one moved. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. Mark stepped forward, closing the lid of the box. That, he said calmly, is none of your concern. Ethan forced himself to stay calm. You've been faking the Toro tracks. Mark smiled. I've been proving a legend. Ethan clenched his fists. What happened to Guy? Marks's expression darkened. Guy was weak. The expedition is stronger without him. A chill ran through Ethan's body. Marks was not just obsessed. He was dangerous. And now, Ethan knew too much. The real nightmare begins. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. Because for the first time since the expedition began, he realized the truth. The Toro wasn't the only monster on this mountain, and Professor Marks wasn't planning on letting them all return. Chapter 6. The Truth Revealed. The fire burned low in the camp, its glow barely holding back the darkness. A bitter wind swept through the mountains, carrying with it the scent of snow and something else, something that smelled like fear. Ethan Brooks sat alone, staring at the flickering flames. His hands were clenched into fists, his heartbeat slow but heavy. He had seen the truth, the wooden claw hidden in the professor's private metal box, the fake Toro footprints carefully placed along their path, the vanishing of Guy Walker just like the 4 men from the last expedition. Professor Marks had been lying, and if Ethan wasn't careful, he might be next. Whispers in the dark. He wasn't the only one who knew something was wrong. Across the fire, Daniel Reed sat sharpening a hunting knife, his face tense. He glanced at Ethan. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Ethan didn't answer. He just stared into the flames. After a moment, Daniel leaned in, speaking low. "You opened it, didn't you?" Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "How did you—" Daniel gave a short, humorless laugh. "I saw you, and I saw the professor watching you. You're lucky you're still breathing." Ethan swallowed. "He's been faking the tracks." Daniel nodded. "I know." Ethan's eyes widened. "You knew?" Daniel sighed. "I suspected. The marks are too perfect, too controlled. It felt staged, and now we have proof." Ethan's stomach churned. "Then what the hell is this expedition really about?" Daniel's voice dropped to a whisper. "That's what we need to find out." A midnight meeting. They couldn't do this alone. They needed help. Ethan and Daniel approached Kareem, their guide, and Dr. Evelyn Carter, the zoologist. If anyone could be trusted, it was them. They gathered behind the tents, away from the professor's watchful gaze. Ethan took a deep breath. "Professor Marks has been lying to us. He's faking the Toro tracks. I found the claw in his metal box." Kareem didn't look surprised. "I know." Ethan felt a chill. "You knew?" Kareem nodded. "This is exactly what happened last time. First, the claw marks, then the disappearances." Dr. Carter folded her arms. "But why? What does he gain from this?" Ethan frowned. "Think about it. If Marks discovers the Toro, he becomes famous. He publishes books. He proves his life's work. Maybe he even gets more funding for future expeditions." Daniel's jaw tightened. "And he's willing to kill for it." A heavy silence fell over them. Then Kareem spoke again. His voice was low. "Careful. There's something else you don't know." Ethan looked at him. "What is it?" Kareem hesitated. Then finally, he said, "Marks didn't just fake the claw marks. He faked the last expedition, too." "The last expedition," Kareem's eyes darkened as he spoke. 3 years ago, I was hired as a guide for Professor Mark's first expedition to these mountains. Just like now, he was obsessed with finding the Toro. We followed his lead, climbed the same path we're climbing now, and just like now, one by one, people disappeared. Ethan's skin prickled. He said the Toro took them? Kareem nodded. Yes, but I never believed him. Daniel frowned. Why not? Kareem's face was grim. Because we never found their bodies. Not a single trace. Not even blood. And yet, every time someone vanished, Marks acted like he expected it. Dr. Carter shivered. Like he planned it. Kareem nodded. Exactly. Ethan felt a sick realization creep into his mind. Then Guy? He didn't just wander off. Kareem's expression darkened. No. And if we don't do something soon, he won't be the last. A dangerous plan. They couldn't just accuse Marks without proof. They needed hard evidence, and there was only one place they were going to find it: his tent. Ethan's pulse quickened. You want us to sneak in? Kareem gave a sharp nod. It's the only way. Daniel cracked his knuckles. I'm in. Dr. Carter hesitated, then exhaled. Fine. But we have to be careful. The plan was set. At midnight, when the professor and the rest of the team were asleep, they would search his tent, and if they found what they were looking for, they would expose the truth. Breaking in. The night was deathly silent. The wind had died down, and the only sound was the soft crunch of snow beneath their boots. Ethan, Daniel, Kareem, and Dr. Carter moved slowly through the camp. Every shadow felt like it was watching them. Marks's tent was larger than the others, positioned at the edge of camp, away from everyone else. Ethan's heart pounded. If Marks caught them, there was no telling what he would do. Kareem crouched by the tent flap and carefully lifted it open. Ethan and Daniel slipped inside. The air was freezing. The smell of damp fabric and old paper filled their noses. Inside, the professor's belongings were neatly arranged: maps, notebooks, and a locked metal case. Daniel pointed. That's it. Ethan reached for it. His hands trembled as he unlatched the lock. With a soft click, it opened. And inside were photographs. Dozens of black and white photos, each labeled with names and dates. And then Ethan saw one that made his blood run cold. It was a photo of 4 men standing beside Marks. smiling at the camera. Written beneath their faces were their names. The 4 men who went missing on the last expedition. But what sent terror racing through Ethan's veins was the date. It wasn't taken before they disappeared. It was taken after the horrifying realization. Daniel's voice was shaky. What? What does this mean? Ethan stared at the photo, his breathing shallow. It means those men never died. Dr. Carter paled. Then where are they? Kareem's voice was like a blade cutting through the darkness. They're still here. A cold wind howled through the tent. A shadow moved outside. And then a voice, low, calm, deadly. You shouldn't have done that, Mr. Brooks. Ethan turned just in time to see Professor Marks standing at the entrance of the tent, a rifle in his hands and his finger on the trigger. Chapter 7. The Night of the Scream. The moment Ethan Brooks saw the rifle in Professor Marks' hands, he felt his blood turn to ice. The professor stood at the entrance of the tent, his expression eerily calm, his finger resting on the trigger. "Put it back," Marks said, his voice low and measured. Ethan's hands clenched around the photograph, the photo of the 4 missing men, taken after they had supposedly disappeared. The proof that Marks had been lying all along. Behind him, Daniel. Kareem and Dr. Carter stood frozen. No one moved. The fire outside crackled softly, the only sound in the dead silence. Marks took a slow step forward, eyes locked on Ethan. "That's mine," he said. Ethan's heartbeat pounded in his ears. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, Daniel took a slow, deliberate step forward. "Professor," he said carefully, "we need to talk." Marks tilted his head slightly. "Do we?" Ethan tightened, his grip on the photo. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. If Marks fired, if he made the wrong move, it would all be over. He took a deep breath and forced himself to speak. "Tell us the truth, Professor." Mark's lips curled into a smile, but his eyes remained cold and lifeless. "The truth?" he repeated. "The truth is irrelevant, Mr. Brooks. What matters is what people believe." Ethan's stomach twisted. "You killed them, didn't you?" he whispered. "The missing men from the last expedition. And Guy. You killed them all." Marks didn't answer, but he didn't deny it either. Instead, he let out a slow breath, tilting his head toward the sky as if admiring the stars. "There is power in legends," he murmured, "and legends require sacrifice." Ethan's breath caught, Daniel's fists tightened. "You're insane." Marks's smile widened. "Am I?" he asked softly. "Or am I the only one who truly understands?" For a long moment, no one spoke. The fire crackled. The wind whispered through the camp. And then, a sound tore through the night. A sound that made every nerve in Ethan's body scream in terror. It was a scream, long, ragged, filled with pain and fear. A scream that came from deep in the darkness of the mountains. A scream that did not sound human. The chaos that followed. The rifle in Mark's hands lowered slightly as he turned toward the sound. For the first time since the expedition began, Ethan saw something he had never expected to see in the professor's eyes. Fear. Another scream ripped through the air, this time closer. Dr. Carter gasped. "What the hell was that?" Kareem muttered a prayer under his breath, his face pale. Ethan felt his entire body tense. His mind screamed that this was impossible. Marks had faked the Toro tracks. Marks had lied, but that sound had been real. It was coming toward them, and fast. The camp erupted into chaos. The remaining porters, those who hadn't already abandoned the expedition, dropped everything and ran. The scientists shouted in confusion. The firelight flickered as shadows moved between the trees, and then, from somewhere just beyond the light of the fire, something massive moved. A shape, dark and towering, shifting in the snow. A deep, rumbling growl filled the air. And for the first time, Professor Marks dropped his rifle. The hunt begins. Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed Dr. Carter's arm and shouted, "Run!" Daniel grabbed Kareem, and the four of them bolted into the darkness, away from the fire, away from the shifting shadow. They heard Marks shouting behind them. But Ethan didn't stop. He didn't look back. Because whatever was in those trees was not human. They ran blindly, stumbling over snow and rocks, lungs burning from the freezing air. The ground shook beneath their feet. A tree branch snapped like a gunshot somewhere behind them, and then another scream. This one was Mark's voice, and it was cut short. Ethan skidded to a stop, heart hammering. The night was dead silent. No wind, no footsteps, and no more Marks. Just silence. Ethan turned to Daniel, gasping for breath. "Did you hear that?" Daniel nodded, his face pale. "He's dead." Dr. Carter swallowed. "How do you know?" Kareem's voice was quiet, almost reverent. because the mountains have taken him. The aftermath. For what felt like an eternity, they stood there, frozen, listening. Then, from deep within the mountains, the growl returned. Soft, almost satisfied. Ethan felt a chill crawl down his spine. He had spent days believing the Toro was a lie, a creation of Mark's obsession. But now he wasn't sure of anything. Daniel wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cold. What do we do now? Kareem took a slow breath. We leave. Dr. Carter hesitated. And tell people what exactly? That a creature killed our expedition leader? No, one answered, because the truth was, they had no proof. And even if they did, who would believe them? The long road home. By morning, the four of them reached the edge of the forest. The storm had passed. The sky was clear and bright, as if nothing had ever happened. There was no sign of marks, no body, no blood, just the wind whispering through the peaks. Ethan turned, staring at the mountains one last time. He had come here believing the expedition was about discovery, about adventure. Now, he knew better. Some things were not meant to be found. Some things were meant to stay legends. As they descended, leaving the mountains behind, Ethan realized something else. Even though they had survived, even though they had escaped the Toro's hunting ground, they would never truly be free, because the night of the scream would stay with them forever. And deep down, Ethan knew the Toro was still watching. Chapter 8. The Real Toro. The mountains were silent. Too silent. Ethan Brooks, Daniel Reed, Kareem Rahman, and Dr. Evelyn Carter stood frozen at the edge of the dark forest, their breath visible in the freezing air. Behind them, Professor Marks was gone. One moment, he had been standing there, his rifle aimed, his eyes burning with obsession. And then, just like that, he was taken. No scream, no struggle, just the sound of something massive moving in the darkness. And then nothing. Ethan's mind raced. Did we actually hear what we thought we heard? Did we actually see it? His heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to believe this was still Marx's trick, that this was just part of his elaborate hoax. But he knew better. The professor was gone, and they were still being watched. The decision to stay or go. Kareem was the first to move. He took a step back, his eyes locked on the tree line. We need to leave. Now. Dr. Carter nodded quickly. Agreed. Daniel, still gripping his knife, hesitated. And go where? We don't even know how far we are from Ked. Kareem pointed to the lower valley. Down. Always down. We follow the slope. The storm has cleared. We can make it back before nightfall if we move now. Ethan wasn't listening. Something felt wrong. They had been standing in the open for minutes now, exposed, vulnerable, yet nothing had happened. If the Toro was still there, why hadn't it attacked? Unless it wanted something else. The search for the truth. Ethan clenched his fists. We can't leave yet. Everyone turned to look at him. Daniel frowned. You're out of your mind. Ethan shook his head. No, listen to me. This whole time we thought Marks was the monster, that he faked everything. But we just saw something real. Whatever it was, it took him. And now we have the chance to prove it exists. Dr. Carter's eyes darkened. Or died trying. Ethan exhaled, sharply. I don't want to go back down that mountain and live the rest of my life wondering if I ran away from the greatest discovery in history. Daniel cursed under his breath. This is insane. Kareem studied Ethan for a long moment. Then, finally, he said, 1 hour. That's all you get. Ethan nodded. They were going after Marks, the trail of the beast. They followed the tracks. The massive claw prints in the snow led away from the camp, deep into the forest. Some of the trees were snapped in half, their branches scarred with deep scratches. Ethan's pulse pounded. Whatever took Marks was big. Daniel gripped his knife tighter. If we see this thing, what's the plan? Dr. Carter scoffed. Pray? Kareem stayed silent. He was focused, his eyes scanning every movement in the trees. Then they saw it. A piece of fabric caught on a broken branch. Ethan rushed forward and pulled. It free. His breath hitched. It was Marks's coat, torn, shredded, covered in blood. Dr. Carter took a slow step back. Jesus Christ. Ethan's grip on the fabric tightened. This wasn't a hoax. This wasn't Marks faking something. This was real. They weren't alone in these mountains. And then the forest went silent again. Not just quiet, completely silent. No wind, no birds, not even the distant sound of shifting snow. A stillness so unnatural that it made Ethan's stomach turn. Kareem whispered, "It knows we're here." The hunter becomes the hunted. A shadow moved between the trees. Huge. Impossible. Something was watching them. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he saw it. the first real glimpse of the creature. It was tall, almost 9 feet, standing on 2 massive legs covered in thick, dark fur. Its arms were long, reaching down past its knees, ending in huge red claws that gleamed in the faint light. And its face, Ethan's body went rigid. It had a beak, sharp, curved, like a bird of prey, yet somehow wrong. But its eyes were the worst part. They were too intelligent. They weren't the eyes of an animal. They were the eyes of something that understood what it was looking at, and it was looking at them. Run. The moment stretched into eternity. Then, the creature moved, faster than anything that size should be able to move. Daniel shouted, "Run!" They bolted. Snow exploded behind them as the creature gave chase. The ground shook with its steps. Ethan ran harder than he had ever run in his life. The freezing air burned his lungs. His legs screamed in pain, but he didn't stop. Because he knew, if he stopped, he would die. Dr. Carter tripped. Ethan grabbed her just in time, yanking her back onto her feet. The creature let out a piercing shriek so loud it rattled his bones. Kareem pointed ahead. "There! The ridge!" They sprinted toward a steep drop, the only way to escape. But the creature was too fast. It leaped forward, swiping its massive claws. Ethan barely ducked in time. The snow beneath his feet gave way. And then they were falling. The final descent. The world spun as they tumbled down the mountainside. Snow and ice blinded Ethan, his body slamming into rocks and tree branches. Then he hit the ground. Hard. For a moment, everything went dark. Then, a voice. "Ethan, get up!" Daniel was pulling him to his feet, his face streaked with blood. Dr. Carter and Kareem were already running down the valley, and above them, the creature stood at the edge of the ridge, watching. It didn't move. It didn't chase. It just stared. And Ethan realized it had let them go. The truth no one would believe. They made it back to Ked the next day, barely alive. The villagers took one look at them and knew. They never asked questions, because they already knew the answers. The 4 survivors never spoke of what they had seen, not to journalists, not to scientists, not to anyone, because some truths were too dangerous to share. Ethan still dreams about it, about the eyes in the dark, about the scream that took marks, and about the one thing he now understands. The Toro was never a myth. It was real, and it was still out there. Chapter 9. The Aftermath. The Journey Back. By the time Ethan Brooks, Daniel Reed, Karim Rahman, and Dr. Evelyn Carter made it back to the village of Ked, they looked like ghosts. Their faces were pale, their bodies bruised and battered. Their clothes were torn, their breath shallow from exhaustion. They had survived, but they were not the same people who had left. The villagers said nothing as they arrived. No one asked about the rest of the expedition. They already knew. One of the elders stepped forward, his wrinkled hands shaking slightly as he looked them over. In a quiet voice, he asked, "Did you see it?" Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it. He didn't know what to say. How could he put into words what they had witnessed? The thing that had been stalking them in the mountains, the creature that had taken marks, was not supposed to exist. And yet it did. Finally, Ethan nodded. The elder sighed, as if he had been expecting this answer. Then he simply said, "You are lucky to be alive." And with that, the villagers took them in, gave them food and shelter, but no one celebrated their return, because in their eyes they were not survivors. They were people who had seen something they were never meant to see. A silent escape. 2. Days later, a government vehicle arrived in the village. Men in dark suits stepped out, officials from the Afghan government. They had been waiting. Word had spread that an expedition had gone missing. Ethan and the others were taken to Kabul, where they were debriefed. They told their story, but they left things out. They didn't mention the creature. They didn't mention the night of the scream. They simply said, "We got lost. The weather was too dangerous. The others didn't make it, and that was enough." No one questioned them further. There were no official search parties, no investigations into Marx's disappearance. The mountains had taken him, and that was the end of the story. As soon as they were cleared to leave, Ethan and the others boarded a flight back to London. The nightmare was over, or so they thought. A city that felt different. When Ethan stepped off the plane at Heathrow Airport, something felt wrong. London hadn't changed. The streets were still crowded, the people still busy, the sky still gray with pollution. But Ethan had changed. Everything felt distant, like a world he no longer belonged to. The honking of cars, the conversations of strangers, the smell of city, streets. It was all too normal, too safe. And Ethan knew he would never be able to go back to his old life, because in the back of his mind, in the darkest corners of his thoughts, he could still hear the wind howling through the mountains. He could still see the shape moving between the trees, and he could still feel the eyes of the Toro watching him. What happened to the survivors? After their return, the four of them drifted apart. Daniel Reed left London within a month. He moved to the countryside, somewhere remote, somewhere far away from mountains. He never spoke about the expedition again, Dr. Evelyn Carter quit her job as a zoologist. She stopped studying animals, stopped researching mysteries of the wild. Instead, she took up a desk job, something safe, something predictable. Karim Rahman returned to Afghanistan, but he never guided another expedition. He refused to go near the mountains again. And Ethan? Ethan tried to go back to normal. He went back to work, tried to cook, tried to live his life like he had before. But he couldn't. Because every time he closed his eyes, he saw Marks's face, just before he disappeared, and worse, he saw the creature that took him. The photograph. 3 months after their return, Ethan received a package in the mail. There was no return address. Inside, he found a single photograph. The image was grainy, old, but unmistakable. It showed a group of men standing in the snow, and among them, at the center of the photograph, was Professor Marks, alive. His face was thin, his eyes sunken, but he was smiling, and in the background of the photo, almost too faint to see, there was something standing in the shadows of the trees, something tall, something watching. Ethan's hands shook as he turned the photograph over. On the back, written in uneven, almost frantic handwriting, were just 3 words, "I am here." Ethan dropped the photo. His pulse thundered in his ears. Marks was alive, and that meant one thing. The Toro wasn't finished yet. A choice to make. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. The photo lay on the table in front of him, the words staring back like a warning. For hours he sat there, trying to decide. Should he go back? Should he try to find Marks? Or should he burn the photograph, forget everything, and move on? The choice was his, but deep down, Ethan already knew. He couldn't walk away. Not now. Not after everything he had seen. Because no matter how far he ran, no matter how much he tried to forget, the Toro was waiting, and this time, it wouldn't let him go so easily. Chapter 10. The Next Expedition. The Photograph That Changed Everything. Ethan Brooks sat in his dimly lit apartment, staring at the photograph on the table in front of him. Professor Marks was alive. The image was old, grainy, slightly faded, but there was no mistake. In the photograph, Mark stood among a group of men, his body thin, his face haunted but smiling, and behind them, a shadow in the trees, something tall, barely visible, watching. And on the back of the photograph, in desperate, uneven handwriting, were 3 words: "I am here." Ethan's hands trembled as he held it. This wasn't over. The Toro wasn't just a legend. It wasn't just a monster. It was something more, and it had let him go for a reason. The search for answers. For days, Ethan tried to ignore it. He went about his routine, cooking, working, pretending that the photograph was just a hoax. But it wasn't. Something deep inside him wouldn't let it go. The memory of Mark's vanishing into the dark, the sound of the creature's low growl, the way the villagers in Cad had refused to speak about the mountains. And now, this photograph. It was like a puzzle, a mystery that refused to stay buried. Ethan started to dig. He went to libraries, searched through old expedition reports, interviewed survivors of past failed explorations, and what he found terrified him, the missing expeditions. Mark's wasn't the first. Over the last 50 years, at least 6 expeditions had vanished in the same region of northern Afghanistan. 72. A Soviet research team vanished without a trace. Their base camp was found abandoned, all equipment left behind. 88. A group of Afghan climbers attempting to map the region never returned. 99. A French anthropologist studying local myths was found alone and delirious, speaking of a great watcher in the mountains. 2006. A military reconnaissance team went missing while on a classified mission. Only 1 body was ever recovered, and it was mutilated beyond recognition. And now, Professor Marks. Ethan felt his pulse quicken as he stared at the reports spread across his table. Whatever the Toro was, it had been there for decades, maybe centuries. Waiting. Watching. And Marks. Somehow, Marks had survived. Contacting the survivors, Ethan wasn't alone in his search. He tracked down the only other people who might have answers. Daniel Reed. Daniel had moved to a remote cabin in Scotland, far from the city. When Ethan called him, Daniel refused to speak about the expedition. "It's over, Ethan. Whatever's in those mountains, just let it be." But Ethan knew Daniel was still afraid, and fear meant there was still something to uncover. Dr. Evelyn Carter. Evelyn had completely abandoned zoology after their return. She now worked in corporate research, never mentioning her past studies. When Ethan asked her about the photograph, her voice was cold, distant. If Marks is alive, that means he never really left. And if he never left, Ethan, then maybe we didn't escape either. Karim was the only one who agreed to meet. They sat in a quiet cafe in Istanbul, far from Afghanistan. Karim looked older, as if the mountains had aged him beyond his years. Ethan showed him the photograph. Karim's face darkened. "He's still there." Ethan nodded. "And I need to go back." Karim sighed, rubbing his temples. "I thought you might say that." Then, after a long silence, he said, "If we go back, we won't come back a second time." But even knowing that, Ethan still had to go. The new team. Ethan couldn't do this alone. He needed a team, not scientists, not explorers, people who were ready to face death. Through months of searching, he put together a group of 5. Karim Rahman, the only man who had guided an expedition into those mountains and survived. James Mercer, a British ex-military survivalist who specialized in hostile environments. Lena Volkova, a Russian tracker, once part of an elite wildlife research unit. Dr. Samuel Hayes, a medical doctor trained for extreme conditions. Ethan Brooks, the man who had seen the Toro with his own eyes. This wasn't just an expedition. This was a rescue mission, or suicide mission, returning to the mountains. By the time they arrived in Kabul, the snow had already started to fall. They traveled by old military trucks, heading toward Khed, the same road, the same twisting mountain paths, but this time, Ethan wasn't just chasing a legend, he was chasing a man who should be dead. The village of Khed was unchanged. The elders still refused to speak about the expedition, and when Ethan told them he was going back, they begged him to stop. One of them, an old woman, grabbed his arm, whispering in Pashto. Karim translated. "She says the mountains have already marked you. If you return, they will claim you." Ethan swallowed hard. He thanked the woman. Then he turned and led his team into the mountains. The first night, the wind howled as they climbed. The tracks from Ethan's last expedition had long been buried under fresh snow. By nightfall, they made camp. The fire flickered, casting long shadows on the snow. Then, a sound. Far away. Low, deep. A growl that vibrated through the ground. Lena stood up, gripping her rifle. That wasn't the wind. Ethan's stomach twisted. The last time he had heard that sound, people had died. The final ascent. By the second day, the snowfall had worsened. James Mercer led the way, his instincts honed from years in war zones. Lena stopped every few minutes checking for tracks. Then, just before sunset, they found the first sign, a broken tent, old, torn, buried under layers of ice. Inside, they found a notebook. It was Marx's handwriting. The last entry read, "I have seen it. I understand now. The Toro is not a creature. It is the mountain itself, and it has accepted me." A chill ran through Ethan's body. James took a deep breath. So what now? Ethan looked up at the towering peaks ahead. The snow swirled like ghosts in the air. They had come this far. There was no turning back now. Ahead, the truth waited. The Toro was waiting. And this time, it would not let them go. Great work today. Every moment you spend practicing brings you closer to mastering your English listening and speaking skills. Remember, progress comes with patience and consistency. If this story inspired you or helped you in your learning journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Easy English Spark channel for more lessons and stories. Keep listening, keep speaking, and keep believing in your growth. I'll see you in the next video. Take care and keep shining.